April 8, 1943. 5 miles above the serene countryside of northern France, the world is a canvas of deep, crystalline blue. From the cockpit of his Focke-Wulf 190, Oberleutnant Ralph Hermican feels like a king surveying his domain. The air is thin and cold, but through his oxygen mask he can't hide a smirk. Below him, he watches a formation of strange, ungainly silhouettes laboriously climbing toward his squadron. They are ponderous, almost comical shapes, straining against gravity itself. These are the brand new American fighters, making their combat debut over occupied Europe. Hermican, a veteran ace of the vaunted Jagdgeschwader 26, studies them with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. To his eyes, trained on the sleek lines of Spitfires and the nimble agility of Soviet fighters, these American machines are an affront to aeronautical design. Their fuselages are barrel-shaped, their greenhouse canopies seem absurdly large, and their wings look far too small to lift their massive bodies. Unable to suppress his amusement, he keys his radio. His voice, crisp and confident, crackles across the channel to his wingman. Die Amis haben uns fliegende Milchflaschen geschickt, he transmits. The Amis have sent us flying milk bottles. Laughter echoes in his ears. The name is perfect. They look less like weapons of war, and more like airborne dairy containers, struggling to reach an altitude where his Focke-Wulf breathes freely. This wasn't just one pilot's idle joke. It was an opinion shared across the entire Luftwaffe fighter arm. These men were the most experienced combat pilots in the world, hardened by 4 years of continuous warfare. Another legendary ace, Oberstleutnant Josef Pips Priller, would later report to headquarters after his own first encounter with the new American fighter. His assessment was even more blunt. "It is meat for the slaughter," he declared. "It flies like a truck, turns like a freight train, and climbs like a pregnant cow." To these German wolves, circling effortlessly in the stratosphere, the flock of lumbering giants below didn't represent a threat. They represented sport. They were, in the parlance of the pilots, Indianer, fat targets pretending to be warriors. The hunt was about to begin. But below the circling German aces, inside the cramped cockpits of those 16 P-47C Thunderbolts, there is no laughter. There is only the thunderous roar of their engines and the intense focus of men flying their very first combat mission. The pilots of the 4th Fighter Group, spread across the French sky, are novices in an untested machine. Among them are men who would become legends, future aces whose names would one day strike fear into the hearts of the Luftwaffe. But on this bright April morning, they are simply the newcomers, facing the most experienced and lethal fighter force in the world. Their commander, Major Donald Blakesley, is one of the few who understands the gravity of the situation. A battle-hardened veteran of the RAF's Eagle squadrons, he has traded the nimble grace of a Spitfire for the brute force of this new American behemoth. As he watches the Focke-Wulf's positioning for an attack, he knows what his men do not yet grasp. That survival in the P-47 required abandoning everything they thought they knew about aerial combat. The Thunderbolt was a radical departure from conventional wisdom. While German engineers had perfected lightweight, interceptors optimized for climb rate and turning performance, the deadly ballet of the dogfight, the American designers at Republic Aviation had created something entirely different. They had built a high-altitude juggernaut. It was a machine that didn't seek to outdance its opponents. It sought to bludgeon them out of the sky using a trinity of mass, power, and unprecedented firepower. The source of that power was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, an 18-cylinder radial beast that generated a staggering 2,000 horsepower, its massive propeller clawing at the thin air. But what the German pilots circling like wolves above could not possibly imagine was the fury hidden within the Thunderbolt's broad, thick wings. It was a secret they were about to learn at a terrible cost, for what truly defined the P-47 was the mathematics of its destruction. Loaded into its wings were 3,400 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition for its 8 Browning machine guns. When a pilot squeezed the trigger, those guns unleashed a combined rate of fire of over 6,000 rounds per minute. It was a torrent of lead, a focused storm of kinetic energy capable of tearing an aircraft to shreds. In less than 2 seconds, a Thunderbolt could fire enough projectiles to saw a Messerschmitt clean in half. What Ralph Hermiken and his fellow aces didn't know, what they couldn't comprehend as they prepared to dive on the flying milk bottles, was that they were witnessing the arrival of the very weapon that would systematically dismantle their entire fighter arm. The laughter from the German cockpits was the sound of a fading era. The roar from the American engines was the sound of the future of aerial warfare arriving with unstoppable force. The story of this airborne behemoth began not in a moment of inspiration, but in a moment of sheer panic. The year was 1940. As German fighters swept the skies of France clear of opposition, an urgent directive reached Republic Aviation's chief designer, the brilliant Georgian-born engineer, Alexander Kartveli. The U.S. Army Air Corps wanted a high-altitude interceptor capable of meeting the Luftwaffe's best on equal terms, but Kartveli understood that matching the enemy was a losing game. He intended to build something that would overwhelm them. Gathering his design team, he was candid about the scale of his vision. "It will be a dinosaur," he admitted to them, "but it will be a dinosaur with good proportions." What he unveiled on May 6, 1941, was exactly that. The XP-47B prototype shocked everyone who saw it. Weighing nearly 10,000 pounds empty, it was a staggering 65% heavier than its predecessor. The reason for its immense size and distinctive, almost pregnant-looking fuselage was a revolutionary piece of technology. A massive turbo-supercharger system. Its complex ducting ran the entire length of the aircraft, feeding engine exhaust gases to a turbine in the tail, which then forced compressed air back to the engine. This system allowed the engine to breathe in the thin, frigid air of the stratosphere, giving it sea-level performance at altitudes where its opponents would be gasping. Test pilots, accustomed to fighters they could practically wrap their arms around, would walk up to the prototype, circle it in disbelief, and invariably ask the same question: "This thing actually flies?" It did. But taming it would prove to be a brutal and often fatal process. At training bases like Bridgeport, Connecticut, Major Hubert "Hub" Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, initially despised the aircraft. His unit's experience was a litany of disaster. Between September 1942 and January 1943, the 56th lost 18 pilots and a staggering 41 aircraft in training accidents. The Thunderbolt was killing more Americans at home than the Germans would in the first months of combat. It was a beast on the ground, prone to violent ground loops on landing. On takeoff, the engine's immense torque could flip an unsuspecting pilot onto their back. And in a dive, it accelerated with such enthusiasm that its pilots became the unwilling discoverers of compressibility, a terrifying phenomenon where shockwaves formed on the wings, freezing the controls solid and turning the plane into an uncontrollable missile. But for the few who survived its unforgiving learning curve, for those who managed to master the beast, they discovered something extraordinary. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, a farm boy from Oklahoma who would go on to become one of America's top aces, described his first flight with awe. "It was like strapping yourself to a locomotive," he recalled. "The power was unbelievable. You didn't fly it, you aimed it." The dinosaur was beginning to show its teeth. When the first combat encounters finally came in the spring of 1943, they seemed to confirm every German prejudice and every Allied fear. The sleek Focke-Wulfs and nimble Messerschmitts ran circles around the hulking Thunderbolts. The P-47 couldn't turn with them. At medium altitudes, it couldn't climb with them. Luftwaffe pilots, with their years of combat wisdom, quickly developed tactics to exploit these glaring weaknesses. They would attack from below, where the heavy American fighters struggled to respond, or they would lure the P-47s into swirling, turning dogfights where agility mattered more than brute force, and where the Thunderbolt was hopelessly outclassed. The statistics from that first month of operations were a brutal indictment of the new fighter. The American groups lost 14 Thunderbolts in exchange for only 3 confirmed German kills. The verdict seemed clear. The Royal Air Force, observing from their adjacent Spitfire squadrons, quietly and politely suggested that the Americans might want to reconsider their choice of aircraft. British pilots, with their dry wit, joked that the best evasive maneuver in a P-47 was to unstrap from the seat and run around the roomy cockpit. The flying milk bottle was not just a joke. It was proving to be a liability. But amidst the grim reports and mounting losses, a strange and unsettling pattern was emerging. A detail that German intelligence, in its confidence, failed to properly analyze. The Thunderbolts that were being shot down had absorbed incredible, almost supernatural amounts of punishment before they finally fell. On one mission on May 4th, a P-47 returned to base riddled with 21 20mm cannon holes and well over 100 machine gun strikes. It was damage that would have vaporized a Spitfire or caused a Messerschmitt to disintegrate in midair. The secret was the Thunderbolt's rugged construction and its massive air-cooled radial engine. Lacking the vulnerable liquid coolant systems that were the Achilles heel of most inline engine fighters, the R-2800 Double Wasp acted as an impromptu 900-kilogram shield for the pilot, capable of swallowing cannon shells and still churning out power. More significantly, on the rare occasions when a green American pilot did manage to get his guns on a target, the results were catastrophic. The Thunderbolt's weapons battery created a convergence zone of pure destruction that German pilots had never before experienced. Unlike the quick ammunition-limited bursts from a 20mm cannon, the American fighter could maintain its horrifying stream of fire for over 30 seconds, an absolute eternity in aerial combat. The German pilots had learned how to fight the P-47, but they were about to discover that surviving its guns was another matter entirely. A lesson was coming, and it would be written in fire and shattered aluminum across the skies of France. The event that would forever change the perception of the P-47 Thunderbolt occurred on June 26, 1943. It was a moment that would become legendary on both sides of the conflict, crystallizing the fighter's mythical toughness. Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 61st Fighter Squadron was part of a formation of 48 Thunderbolts returning from an escort mission. Flying at the vulnerable rear of the formation, he was caught in the opening seconds of a perfectly executed ambush. 16 Focke-Wulf 190s, led by the younger brother of the famous ace Adolf Galland, dove from the sun with an overwhelming speed advantage. Johnson's Thunderbolt was engulfed in a storm of steel. In seconds, 21 20mm cannon shells exploded across his aircraft. The canopy shattered, spraying the cockpit with razor-sharp fragments. Hot hydraulic fluid scalded his face, the engine cowling was ripped away, and a fire erupted behind his instrument panel. Wounded in the nose and leg by shrapnel, Johnson's first instinct was survival. Get out. He reached for the canopy release, but it wouldn't budge. A cannon shell had exploded in the track, welding it shut. He was trapped in a burning, disintegrating aircraft, 5 miles above enemy territory. What happened next defied every known principle of combat damage. Despite having no forward visibility through the oil-smeared windscreen and controls that barely responded, Johnson managed to level the crippled fighter and point it toward England. Then it got worse. A lone Focke-Wulf 190 discovered the wounded straggler. Its pilot, an unknown German from Jagdgeschwader 26, positioned himself behind the helpless Thunderbolt and began a methodical, almost clinical execution. He opened fire, pouring his entire ammunition load of 20mm cannon shells into Johnson's plane. Still, the Thunderbolt flew. The German repositioned and fired again, this time with his machine guns. Finally, his cannons exhausted, the German pilot pulled alongside, his cockpit just feet from Johnson's. Johnson could see his face clearly. Young, blonde, his expression shifting from confident aggression to utter confusion, and then to something approaching awe. What was holding this American plane together? The German fell back once more and emptied his remaining machine gun ammunition into the flying wreck. Nothing. It still flew. In a final, extraordinary gesture, the German pilot pulled alongside one last time. He shook his head in apparent amazement, gave Johnson an informal salute, and peeled away, his job seemingly impossible to complete. Johnson miraculously made it back to the British coast, landing at Manston as his engine finally seized on the runway. The ground crew stopped counting the bullet and shrapnel holes after reaching 200. 3 of the 4 main structural supports of the fuselage were shot through. The aircraft by all rights should have ceased to exist. Its survival sent shockwaves through both air forces. American engineers realized they had underestimated their own creation, while German intelligence, receiving the combat report, initially refused to believe it was possible. The flying milk bottle was a monster. The survival of Robert Johnson's aircraft was more than a miracle. It was a revelation. It proved that the Thunderbolt could take a punch, but now, American pilots had to learn how to throw one. Through brutal trial and error, commanders like Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zemke of the 56th Fighter Group began to piece together the secret. They were learning to ignore their dogfighting instincts. The new mantra, preached in every briefing room, was a rejection of a decade of fighter doctrine. Don't turn with them. Don't climb with them at low altitude. Use your weight. Use your power. Use your guns. The Thunderbolt's massive weight, once its greatest liability, was about to become its most terrifying weapon. In a dive, the 7-ton fighter became an unstoppable force of kinetic energy. From 30,000 feet, a P-47 could plummet towards the Earth at 550 miles per hour, a speed no German fighter could hope to match, even in a vertical dive. This incredible velocity could then be converted back into altitude in a zoom climb, a blistering ascent that left any pursuing Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf helplessly behind, stalled out in the thin air. This principle gave birth to a tactic that would become the Thunderbolt's deadly signature. Pilots like Captain Walker Bud Mahurin perfected what they called the Thunderbolt turkey shoot, though tacticians would call it boom and zoom. Instead of engaging in swirling dogfights, P-47 formations would climb to the icy stratosphere, 30,000 feet or higher, effectively placing themselves on the high ground of the battlefield. From this perch they would patiently wait. When Luftwaffe fighters appeared below to attack the bombers, the Thunderbolts would roll inverted and dive. To the German pilots it was like an avalanche falling from the sky. The diving P-47s accelerated so rapidly that trying to draw a bead on them was impossible. And then, at the bottom of the dive, the American heavy machine guns would speak. German pilots who survived described it not as gunfire, but as facing a solid wall of lead. The true, horrifying revelation of this new American way of war came on August 17, 1943, during the perilous dual raid on the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt and Regensburg. This mission would demonstrate the Thunderbolt's terrifying effectiveness when employed properly. Major David Schilling, leading the 62nd Fighter Squadron, spotted a formation of Messerschmitt 110 Zerstörer, destroyers, positioning to attack the B-17s. These were the Luftwaffe's specialized bomber killers, twin-engine behemoths armed with heavy cannons and rockets. Schilling's flight of 4 Thunderbolts rolled into their attack dive from 28,000 feet. Unteroffizier Heinrich Roth, a gunner and one of the Me-110s who survived, later recounted the encounter in a prisoner interrogation. "The American fighters came down like hammers from heaven," he said. "I opened fire at 800 meters, good hits. I saw them strike the fighter's wing. The P-47 didn't even wobble. Then he paused. He fired. The aircraft ahead of us simply came apart. Not shot down," Roth emphasized. "Destroyed. Wings separated from the fuselage, tail severed, the crew compartment shredded into metal confetti. In 2 seconds, a 110 became nothing." In less than a minute, Schilling's flight annihilated 8 of the heavy German fighters. The Luftwaffe had never experienced such concentrated instantaneous destruction. The derisive laughter of April was a distant memory. By August it had been replaced by the chilling realization that the Americans had not built a clumsy dogfighter. They had unleashed a bird of prey. By the autumn of 1943, the Luftwaffe was discovering another horrifying reality about the P-47 Thunderbolt. The very thing that made it so large and heavy, its revolutionary turbo-supercharger system, gave it an almost magical advantage in the one place it mattered most: the frigid thin air of the high frontier. While German fighters relied on engine-driven mechanical superchargers that saw their performance degrade significantly above 25,000 feet, the P-47's exhaust-driven turbo maintained the engine's rated power output all the way up to 30,000 feet. For the German pilots, the high altitudes were a realm of thin air and gasping engines. For the Thunderbolt, it was a home court advantage. This deadly truth was driven home in the most brutal way possible on October 8, 1943. On that day, one of Germany's most celebrated aces, Oberleutnant Hans Philipp, a veteran of over 500 combat missions with 206 aerial victories to his name, led his Jagdgeschwader 1 against a formation of B-17s over Bremen. At 28,000 feet, Philipp found his Focke-Wulf 190A6 felt sluggish, its powerful BMW engine starved for oxygen, its controls heavy and unresponsive. Nearly 6 miles above the earth, his world-class fighter was struggling to perform. He never saw the danger lurking thousands of feet above him. There, cruising effortlessly at 32,000 feet, were the P-47s of the 56th Fighter Group. Among them was Robert S. Johnson, now a seasoned combat pilot well on his way to becoming an ace. He spotted Philipp's distinctive Focke-Wulf, with its elaborate nose art far below. The German fighters were sitting ducks. Johnson rolled his Thunderbolt over and dove. There was no dogfight, no contest of skill. It was a simple, brutal equation of physics and firepower. Johnson's after-action report was as clinical as it was devastating. Opened fire at 300 yards, 30-degree deflection. Observed strikes along entire fuselage. Enemy aircraft exploded. No parachute observed. The death of Hans Philipp sent a shockwave of fear and disbelief through the Luftwaffe. If one of their best, a man who had survived the Battle of Britain and the brutal Eastern Front, could be swatted from the sky with such ease, what chance did an average pilot have? The era of the invincible German ace was over. The German High Command, alarmed by the mounting losses of its best pilots, ordered an immediate and thorough investigation into the P-47's capabilities. The final report, delivered to a stunned Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring in November 1943, was a sobering eulogy for German air superiority. It confirmed that the Thunderbolt's service ceiling exceeded 42,000 feet, far higher than any German fighter could effectively reach. Its dive speed approached the sound barrier. Its armor included a thick steel plate behind the pilot and bulletproof glass in the windscreen. But the most disturbing conclusion was a confirmation of what happened to Robert Johnson's plane. Its rugged construction allowed it to absorb damage that would destroy 3 conventional fighters and still bring its pilot home. The high frontier, once the preferred ambush ground for the Luftwaffe, had now become the P-47's killing field. The wolves no longer owned the heights. They were now the prey. By the beginning of 1944, the Thunderbolt had proven it could survive, it could dive, and it could kill. But it still carried one significant, often fatal flaw: a sluggish rate of climb. German pilots knew that if they could force a P-47 into a vertical fight, they still held the advantage. That was about to change. In January, a new variant began arriving in England that would complete the Thunderbolt's transformation from a formidable opponent into an undisputed master of the skies, the P-47D-22. The key to its evolution was a massive new Hamilton Standard hydromatic propeller. Its blades, 13 feet in diameter, were broad and squared off, like giant paddles or massive oars designed to bite into the air with incredible authority. The improvement was immediate and dramatic. Where earlier Thunderbolts had struggled to climb at an anemic 2,200 feet per minute, the paddle blade variants could now surge upwards at over 3,000 feet per minute, matching or even exceeding the best German fighters at most altitudes. Its last major weakness had been erased. For the Luftwaffe, this discovery was a nasty surprise. Hauptmann Heinz Knoke, a veteran ace with over 200 combat missions, encountered the new variants in February 1944. He wrote in his combat diary with a sense of shock, "The fat American fighters have learned to climb. We bounced to formation near Hanover, expecting our usual advantage. They turned into us and climbed with us. When we tried to disengage, they followed us up to 30,000 feet. Schmidt was caught and blown apart. Nothing left but smoke and fragments. These are not the same machines we laughed at last year." This new propeller did more than just improve performance. It changed the very sound of the Thunderbolt. The blade tips, now slicing through the air at supersonic speeds, created a deep, thundering roar that could be heard for miles. German ground troops learned to identify approaching P-47s by this sound alone. It was a menacing, earth-shaking rumble that signaled death from above. They gave it a fitting name: Donnerschlag, the thunderclap. With its performance now on par with its enemies in every respect, the P-47 was ready for the final stage of its evolution. Equipped with external fuel tanks, it could now carry the fight deep into Germany, escorting the heavy bombers all the way to their targets and back. But as the new P-51 Mustang began to take over the long-range escort role, the Thunderbolt, with its immense structural strength, was unleashed on a new mission, a role that would make it the most feared aircraft on the continent: ground attack. Designers fitted it with bomb shackles and rocket stubs. The P-47 could carry a payload that was simply staggering for a single-engine fighter: 2 1,000-pound bombs under the wings and a 500-pounder on its belly, a bomb load equal to that of an early war medium bomber. Later variants added racks for 10 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, each packing the explosive punch of a 105mm artillery shell. The beast had fully evolved. It was no longer just a high-altitude interceptor. It was now a dominant dogfighter, a long-range escort, and a terrifyingly precise dive bomber and rocket platform all in one. The laughter of 1943 was a distant echo, drowned out by the thunder of a fully realized weapon of war. On June 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe discovered just how completely the balance of air power had shifted. As the Allies stormed the beaches of Normandy, over 500 P-47 Thunderbolts provided air cover, creating an impenetrable umbrella over the invasion fleet. German fighters attempting to reach the landing zones were simply massacred. Oberleutnant Wolfgang Fischer was one of only a handful of German pilots to even see the beaches that day. His report was a testament to the futility of their cause. "The sky belonged to the Americans," he stated. Thunderbolts were stacked from sea level to 30,000 feet. "We tried to break through at dawn, 12 fighters from our Gruppe. I was the only one to return. The P-47s were waiting at every altitude. Their guns turned our fighters into aluminum rain." With the Luftwaffe swept from the sky, the P-47s were unleashed in the role that would cement their legend. In the weeks following D-Day, they became the scourge of the German army, systematically destroying any attempt to reinforce the front. The statistics compiled by the 9th Air Force for June alone were staggering. 651 locomotives, nearly 4,000 trucks, over 500 tanks and armored vehicles destroyed. The Wehrmacht was paralyzed, forced to move only under the cover of darkness. For the German soldiers on the ground, the Thunderbolt became a creature of pure terror. Oberst Hans von Luck, commanding a Panzer Grenadier regiment, experienced their attacks firsthand. They came in low, he recalled, so low you could see the pilots' faces. The sound was terrifying, engines roaring, rockets screaming. Then the hammer of those heavy machine guns. I watched a column of our trucks simply cease to exist. 20 vehicles transformed into burning wreckage in one pass. The psychological effect on the men was devastating. They called them jabos, fighter bombers. But these were flying artillery with the accuracy of snipers. While the Thunderbolt was savaging the German war machine in France, it was simultaneously proving its worth half a world away, in the vast and unforgiving Pacific theater. There, its ruggedness, firepower, and high-altitude performance were perfectly suited to the long-distance island-hopping war against Japan. Colonel Neil Kirby, commanding the 348th Fighter Group, demonstrated the P-47's prowess on October 11, 1943. Leading just 4 Thunderbolts against a force of 40 Japanese aircraft, Kirby personally shot down 6 enemy planes, an act of skill and courage that earned him the Medal of Honor. The Japanese, accustomed to fighting nimbler but more fragile Allied fighters, were completely unprepared for the P-47. The legendary Japanese ace Saburo Sakai, who encountered them over New Guinea, wrote of his shock, "We called them monsters. Our 20mm cannon, which could destroy a P-40 with a few hits, seemed to have no effect. I put dozens of rounds into one Thunderbolt and watched it fly away trailing smoke. Their return fire was terrifying, streams of heavy bullets that tore our aircraft apart." To meet the unique demands of the Pacific, Republic developed the ultimate long-range variant, the P-47N. With extra fuel stored in wet wings, its range was extended to an incredible 350 miles. The short-legged fighter that could barely cross the English Channel in 1943 had evolved into a true strategic weapon, now capable of escorting B-29 superfortresses all the way to the shores of Japan itself. As the war entered its final, brutal year, a new and terrifying sound began to haunt the skies over Germany. It was the whisper of the future, the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter, with a top speed of over 540 miles per hour. It was a quantum leap in aviation technology, seemingly untouchable by any propeller-driven aircraft. For Allied bomber crews, it was a silver shark that could appear without warning, slash through their formations with devastating cannon fire, and vanish in an instant. It was Germany's wonder weapon, a last hope to turn the tide of the air war. But the pilots of the P-47 Thunderbolt, masters of their own brutish machine, were not easily intimidated. They quickly discovered the jet had 2 critical vulnerabilities. The first was during takeoff and landing, when it was slow, cumbersome, and lacked the power to maneuver. The second, and more crucial weakness, was against the one aircraft that could challenge it in its own element, a diving Thunderbolt. On November 27, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer of the 352nd Fighter Group proved the impossible could be done. Spotting an Me-262 far below, he rolled his P-47 into a steep dive from 28,000 feet. His aircraft screamed towards the earth, the airframe groaning as it approached 500 miles per hour. The German jet pilot, confident in his superior speed, never saw him coming. Meyer closed the distance and opened fire from 400 yards. His combat report was stark. The enemy aircraft disintegrated under fire. Large pieces, including both engines, separated from the fuselage. The pilot did not escape. The .850 caliber guns, it turned out, were just as effective against the future as they were against the present. To counter the jet threat more directly, Republic Aviation produced the ultimate Thunderbolt, the P-47M, a specialized interceptor. Its engine was boosted with water methanol injection to produce an incredible 2,800 horsepower. With refined aerodynamics, these ultimate Thunderbolts could reach 470 miles per hour in level flight, fast enough to hunt jets and chase down V-1 flying bombs. Major George Bostwick, flying one of these new P-47Ms, shot down two Me-262s in March 1945. His tactical report summarized the American doctrine: the jets are faster, but they can't turn, and they can't take punishment. One good burst from our battery and they come apart. That's when we get them. But the German war machine had one last desperate gamble. On New Year's Day, 1945, the Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatte, a surprise all-out attack by nearly 900 fighters against Allied airfields across Belgium and the Netherlands. At Airfield Y-34 near Metz, home to the P-47s of the 365th Fighter Group, the attack was a stunning success. German fighters swept in at treetop level, destroying 22 Thunderbolts on the ground. A captured, arrogant German pilot was brought to the command post. Pointing to the burning American aircraft that littered his field, he taunted the group's commander, Major George Brooking. What do you think of that? Brooking's response became a legend throughout the 9th Air Force, a perfect eulogy for the entire German war effort. He calmly pointed to the flight line, where ground crews were already pushing the smoldering wreckage aside and preparing the hard stands. By tomorrow, Brooking said, we'll have 40 new ones. How long will it take you to replace your pilots? The German pilot's smirk vanished. He knew the answer. Within 48 hours, factory-fresh P-47s, flown in from depots in England, filled the flight line. Operation Bodenplatte was a strategic catastrophe for the Luftwaffe. They had lost 271 aircraft, but more importantly, they had lost 213 pilots, including many of their last irreplaceable instructors and squadron leaders. The Americans lost 134 aircraft, every single one of which was replaced within a week. The battle was a microcosm of the entire war. Germany had traded its last precious lifeblood for a handful of replaceable machines. The Thunderbolt was more than just an airplane. It was the symbol of an industrial avalanche that had finally and completely buried its enemy. The ultimate story of the P-47 Thunderbolt is not just one of tactics or technology, but of numbers. Numbers so vast they represent a force of nature. Republic Aviation produced 15,783 Thunderbolts during the war, more than any other American fighter. At the peak of production, the sprawling factory in Farmingdale, Long Island, completed one P-47 every hour, around the clock. A second plant in Evansville, Indiana, built on empty farmland in 1942, was producing 500 aircraft per month by 1944. This was not the mass production of a simple object. Each Thunderbolt was a masterpiece of complexity, composed of 65,000 individual parts. Each one contained 8 miles of electrical wiring, 2,000 pounds of aluminum, and 300 pounds of rubber. Its double wasp engine alone contained 2,400 individual components, machined to tolerances of 1,000th of an inch. Yet, this intricate work was done by an army of American workers, many of them women who had never set foot in a factory before Pearl Harbor, who assembled these flying fortresses with a precision that exceeded peacetime standards. And for every aircraft, there was a river of consumables to feed it. By mid-1944, Thunderbolts of the 9th Air Force alone were firing over 10 million rounds of .50 caliber ammunition every month. To meet this demand, arsenals like the one in Lake City, Missouri, produced 30 million rounds monthly, each cartridge a perfect, reliable instrument of destruction. The fuel consumption was even more enormous. A single Thunderbolt burned up to 300 gallons an hour in combat. The Ninth Air Force consumed over 25 million gallons of high-octane aviation fuel every month, all of it produced in American refineries and shipped across a contested Atlantic in tankers that were themselves products of American mass production. But even more impressive than the production of machines was the production of men. By 1944, the United States was graduating 30,000 pilots a year from advanced training, more than Germany had trained in the entire war. And these were not rookies rushed to the front. Each American P-47 pilot arrived in Europe with a minimum of 400 hours of flight training, including 100 hours in advanced fighters. By contrast, the Luftwaffe, bled dry of its veterans and instructors, was sending pilots into combat with less than 100 hours of total flight time. The quality showed. Lieutenant Eugene Roberts, arriving in England in September 1944, exemplified the American advantage. I had 420 hours in my logbook, including 75 hours in the P-47, he stated. I'd fired at towed targets, practiced deflection shooting, studied gun camera film from actual combat. My first mission, I knew exactly what to do. The German pilot I faced couldn't have had half my experience. It wasn't even a fair fight. Perhaps the final, most eloquent verdict on this reality came from the very man who had mocked the P-47 2 years earlier. In March 1945, Oberstleutnant Josef Pips Priller was interviewed by propaganda officials. His statement, deemed too demoralizing for publication, was a complete capitulation to the American way of war. The Thunderbolt is the best fighter bomber ever built, Priller admitted. Its firepower is unprecedented. But beyond the machine is what it represents, unlimited American production. They lose 10, they build 20. We lose one, it's gone forever. Their pilots arrive better trained than our instructors. They have fuel for training, ammunition for practice, spare parts for everything. We have nothing but courage. And courage without resources is just delayed defeat. He ended with a haunting reflection. We laughed at them in 1943. We're not laughing now. When you hear those guns, you know death has come calling. The sound haunts us. Mechanical, precise, unstoppable. Like everything American, it's about overwhelming material superiority. They didn't beat us through better tactics or braver pilots. They buried us under an avalanche of steel and lead. The legacy of the P-47 Thunderbolt is written not just in statistics of destruction, but in the minds of the men who faced it. By 1945, its psychological impact was a weapon in itself. German ground troops suffered from what their medical officers termed Jabo fever. Jabo fever, a condition of extreme stress, complete with physical tremors and nausea, that appeared whenever Thunderbolts were reported in the area. Veterans who had faced Spitfires and Soviet Yaks without flinching became physically ill at the prospect of a mission against P-47s. The distinctive thunder of its approach caused entire columns to panic and scatter, knowing that survival was measured in the few seconds it took to find cover. The reason for this terror is found in the final, cold arithmetic of the war. In Europe, P-47 units were credited with destroying over 7,000 German aircraft, both in the air and on the ground. They obliterated 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored fighting vehicles, and nearly 70,000 trucks. In the Pacific, they swept the skies of Japanese aircraft and strangled their supply lines. Thunderbolt units achieved a staggering 4.6 to 1 kill ratio in aerial combat while suffering the lowest loss rate of any Allied fighter bomber, the USA. Complete reversal of German opinion is perfectly preserved in the cool, bureaucratic language of their own intelligence files, captured from the interrogation center at Oberursel. An entry from April 1943 dismisses the P-47 as a large, unmaneuverable fighter, minimal threat. By June 1944, the assessment had changed to dominant fighter bomber, devastating firepower, critical threat at all altitudes. The final entry, dated March 1945, is a statement of total defeat. best fighter bomber of the war. Combination of firepower, durability, and performance unmatched. Unsurvivable in direct engagement. Years after the war, at a 1985 reunion of former adversaries, General Adolf Galland, the legendary head of the Luftwaffe's fighter arm, was asked about the Thunderbolt. His response was a frank admission. "We made a terrible mistake in 1943, he said. "We saw this big heavy fighter and we laughed. We were the ones who didn't understand. The Americans didn't try to build a European fighter. They built an American one, designed around production, firepower, and survivability. They understood that in a war of attrition, the plane that could take punishment and deliver devastating firepower would win." Galland recalled flying a captured P-47 after the war. "The power was incredible," he remembered with awe. "But what really impressed me was realizing that America built over 15,000 of these complex machines while fighting a two-ocean war. That's when I knew we never had a chance. Those guns," he added, his voice lowering. "We called them Roosevelt's piano because of the sound they made. Once you heard that sound, you never forgot it. Many of my friends heard it for the last time." Today, a restored P-47D Thunderbolt sits in quiet majesty at the United States Air Force Museum. Its polished metal skin and bold markings belie the violence of its past. Its placard lists statistics and battle honors. But the true story, the human story, is captured in a quote displayed nearby, taken from the 1945 interrogation of an unnamed German pilot. He, like Ralph Hermican and Pips Priller, had been there at the beginning. His words serve as the final, definitive epitaph for the Luftwaffe's encounter with the Thunderbolt. "We laughed when we first saw them," the pilot said. "Fat, ugly American fighters that couldn't turn, couldn't climb, couldn't fight. We stopped laughing when we realized they didn't need to turn or climb. They just pointed those guns at you, and you ceased to exist." The laughter died with our comrades. The P-47 Thunderbolt entered combat as an object of derision and ended the war as an instrument of annihilation. In the 2 years between, 8 synchronized Browning machine guns rewrote the rules of aerial warfare and buried the Luftwaffe under an avalanche of lead. In April 1943, German pilots had laughed at the ungainly American fighter. By May 1945, there were no German pilots left to laugh. The thunder had spoken and the sky belonged to America.